The scent of sterile gauze, burnt sand, and copper never really washes out. You can scrub your skin until it's raw. Stand under scalding water until the apartment's ancient pipes scream in protest. But the ghost of the trauma lingers. It clings to the back of your throat. Dr. Natalie Cross jolted awake, her chest heaving, her fingers clawing at the cheap cotton sheets. For a terrifying fraction of a second, the harsh glare of the street lamp filtering through the blinds was the blinding flash of an IED outside Kandahar. The rumble of the early morning garbage truck was the distant thud of incoming mortar fire. She held her breath, counting backward from 5, 5, 4. You are in Seattle. 3. You are safe. 2. Cole is down the hall. 1. Natalie exhaled, the tense coils of her muscles slowly releasing. She ran a trembling hand through her short, damp blonde hair, grounding herself in the present. She wasn't Major Cross anymore, the hardened trauma surgeon who patched up shattered kids in a dusty medical tent while the world exploded around them. She was just Natalie, single mother, private investigator, a woman trying to navigate a civilian world that felt infinitely more foreign than any war zone she'd ever deployed to. Throwing her legs over the edge of the bed, she listened to the rhythmic, soft breathing coming from the next room. She walked silently down the narrow hallway of their two-bedroom apartment. Peering through the half-open door, Cole was sprawled across his bed, one leg kicked over his blankets, his face buried in a worn-out stuffed bear he'd had since he was 3. He was 8 years old now, a whirlwind of boundless energy and bruised knees, with his mother's sharp green eyes and a heart too gentle for the world they lived in. Looking at him, the phantom smells of the battlefield vanished, replaced by the scent of laundry detergent and boyish innocence. Cole was her anchor. He was the only reason she had survived the suffocating weight of PTSD that had threatened to drown her when her honorable discharge papers were signed. Every decision she made, every dangerous shadow she stepped into as a PI, was to ensure that a roof stayed over his head and that his biggest worry remained his math homework, not survival. Natalie quietly closed his door and headed for the kitchen. By 6 a.m., she was nursing a mug of pitch-black coffee, reviewing the meager files on her desk. Cross Investigations wasn't exactly raking in the millions. Her office was in the front room of her apartment, squeezed between a dying ficus plant and a bookshelf crammed with medical journals and criminology textbooks. Her clientele mostly consisted of suspicious spouses and local business owners dealing with petty theft. It paid the bills, barely. "Mom?" Natalie turned, her hardened features instantly melting into a soft, genuine smile. Cole stood in the kitchen doorway, rubbing his eyes, his pajamas rumpled. "Morning, buddy," she said, setting her mug down and pulling him into a hug. She pressed a kiss to his messy hair. "Did you sleep well?" "Yeah, I had a dream I was a superhero," he mumbled into her shoulder, wrapping his small arms tightly around her waist. "I could fly and shoot lasers." "Well, you're definitely my superhero," she whispered, squeezing him tight. A sharp pang of guilt hit her. She wanted to give him a house with a backyard, a dog, a life wrapped in bubble wrap. Instead, he had a mother who kept a loaded Glock 19 locked in a biometric safe under the floorboards. By 8 a.m., the superhero had been fed, dressed, and dropped off at the local elementary school. Natalie watched him run through the chain-link gates, waving until he disappeared into the building. Only then did the warm, maternal softness fade from her eyes, replaced by the cool, calculating gaze of a predator scanning its territory. Returning to her makeshift office, she flipped the plastic sign in the window from closed to open. She didn't expect much. It was a rainy Tuesday. But at 10:15 a.m., the doorbell chimed, a sharp, crisp sound that cut through the low hum of the traffic outside. Natalie looked up from her paperwork. Standing in the threshold was a woman who clearly did not belong in this part of town. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal trench coat, a silk scarf knotted perfectly at her neck, and a pair of pearl earrings that probably cost more than Natalie's car. But it wasn't the wealth that caught Natalie's trained eye. It was the rigid posture, the white-knuckled grip on the designer leather handbag, the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the woman's jaw. As a doctor, Natalie had delivered 1,000 death notices. She knew what grief looked like when it was trying to hold itself together with sheer willpower. "Can I help you?" Natalie asked, her voice calm and level, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around the modest office, taking in the framed medical degrees hanging next to her private investigator license. "You are Natalie Cross, the investigator?" "I am. Please, have a seat." The woman sat down stiffly, keeping her handbag perched on her lap like a shield. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I live in Oakwood Estates." Natalie raised an eyebrow. Oakwood Estates was a sprawling, gated community nestled in the Emerald Hills overlooking the city. It was a place of manicured lawns, infinity pools, and ironclad security, a fortress for the 1%. "It's a long way from Oakwood to my office, Mrs. Vance," Natalie said gently, leaning forward. "What brings you here?" Eleanor took a ragged breath, her perfectly applied facade cracking. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "My husband, Arthur, he died 3 weeks ago." "I'm very sorry for your loss," Natalie offered, her tone laced with genuine empathy. She knew the hollow ache of losing someone. The police said it was an accident," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. She unclasped her handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the scarred wooden desk. "They said he was cleaning the gutters. That the ladder slipped. He fell 20 feet onto the stone patio. Broken neck. Instantaneous." Natalie didn't touch the envelope yet. "And you don't believe them?" Arthur was terrified of heights, Eleanor stated flatly, her eyes locking onto Natalie's. "Terrified. He wouldn't even step on a step stool to change a light bulb in the kitchen, let alone climb a 20-foot aluminum ladder in the damp morning mist. I told the detectives this. I begged them to look closer. But Arthur was 71. He had high blood pressure. They wrote it off as a clumsy tragedy of an old man." Natalie finally reached for the envelope. "What's in here?" "The coroner's report, the crime scene photos. I hired a lawyer to get them. And I hired you to look at them." Eleanor leaned closer, her perfume, something floral and expensive, wafting across the desk. "They say you used to be a doctor, a military surgeon. They say you see things regular cops don't." Natalie unspooled the red string of the envelope. She slid the glossy photographs onto her desk. For a moment, she wasn't in her dusty office. She was back in the triage tent, her mind shifting into the cold, analytical gear of medical diagnostics. She looked at the photos of Arthur Vance, a wealthy man, lying at an unnatural angle on expensive imported stone, a shattered ladder beside him. But Natalie wasn't looking at the big picture, she was looking at the details. The canvas of the human body rarely lied. She studied the lividity, the pooling of the blood. She looked closely at the high-resolution close-ups of Arthur's neck and face. Wait. Natalie pulled a magnifying glass from her drawer and leaned over a photo of Arthur's eyes. The police saw a man who had fallen and broken his neck. But Natalie's eyes caught something else. Tiny, pinpoint red dots clustered in the whites of his eyes and on his inner eyelids. Petechial hemorrhaging. You don't get petechial hemorrhages from a fall. You get them when the blood vessels in the eyes burst due to intense pressure. You get them from strangulation. From suffocation. Natalie felt a cold prickle run down her spine. The adrenaline, familiar and potent, began to hum in her veins. She shifted her gaze to the victim's hands in the photos. There was foreign tissue under the fingernails of his right hand. And a faint, crescent-shaped bruise on his left forearm. Defensive wounds. Arthur Vance hadn't fallen. He was held down, suffocated, and then thrown off the roof to stage the scene. Natalie looked up at Eleanor, who was watching her with breathless anticipation. "Mrs. Vance," Natalie said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the gentle bedside manner and adopting the steel of a soldier going into battle. "Your husband didn't fall." Eleanor let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. It was a horrific validation. But a validation nonetheless. "You can prove it?" "I can prove his autopsy missed crucial evidence of foul play," Natalie said, tapping the photograph. "But here is the real question. Eleanor, if someone wanted to murder your husband and disguise it as a tragic accident, they had to bypass the perimeter security of Oakwood Estates. Get past your private alarms. Do the deed silently. Stage the scene. And vanish without a trace." Natalie leaned back in her chair, the wheels in her mind spinning rapidly. That kind of clinical precision, it's not a crime of passion. It's professional. Eleanor wiped her eyes, her expression hardening into something vengeful. "Then find who did it. I don't care what it costs. I have the resources, Ms. Cross. I don't just take cases for the money," Natalie said quietly, glancing at a framed photo of Cole on her desk, smiling. Missing a front tooth. She needed the money to protect him. Yes, but she also had an oath. First, do no harm. And letting a killer walk free in her city was doing harm. She pulled a fresh notepad toward her and grabbed a pen. "Tell me about your neighbors. Mrs. Vance, has anyone else in Oakwood Estates suffered a sudden, tragic accident recently?" Eleanor froze, her eyes widening in realization. "My God, last month, Marcus Sterling from the Homeowners Association. They said he drowned in his own hot tub. Heart attack induced by the heat," the coroner said. "And before that, in the spring, Sarah Jenkins, carbon monoxide poisoning in her garage. They ruled it a tragic oversight. She left the car running. 3 accidents. 3 wealthy victims in the same gated community within 6 months. The police saw a string of unfortunate events. Dr. Natalie Cross saw a localized epidemic. A predator was hunting in the pristine, manicured gardens of Oakwood Estates, masking murders as suburban tragedies. And no one was looking for them." Natalie closed the file, the sharp scent of coffee in the room suddenly overwhelmed by the phantom scent of copper and blood. The war was over, but a new battle had just begun. "All right, Eleanor," Natalie said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "You just hired yourself a private investigator." The rain in Seattle didn't fall, it hung in the air like a cold, damp breath. It slicked the roads and painted the city in shades of slate and charcoal. Natalie's 10-year-old Subaru Outback. Its heater rattling a constant, offbeat rhythm, felt distinctly out of place as she pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of Oakwood Estates. The entrance looked less like a residential neighborhood and more like a high-security compound. A stone guardhouse sat in the center of the driveway, flanked by multiple high-definition security cameras tracking her every move. Natalie rolled down her window, handing her driver's license and private investigator credentials to the uniformed guard. He was young, maybe early 20s, but his posture was rigid, eyes scanning the interior of her messy car before settling on her face. "I'm expected," Natalie said, her voice carrying the authoritative clip of a former military officer. "Eleanor Vance, 4402 Crestview Drive." The guard tapped on his tablet. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Vance authorized your entry." He handed back her IDs. "Follow the main road up the hill. It's the third driveway on the left past the tennis courts. Have a good day." As the massive gates swung open, Natalie felt a familiar tightening in her chest. It was the same hyper-vigilance she used to feel rolling out of the green zone in Kabul. You didn't survive a war zone by assuming you were safe just because the scenery was pretty. And Oakwood Estates was undeniably pretty. Manicured lawns stretched out like emerald carpets beneath ancient, dripping cedar trees. The houses were sprawling, custom-built mansions with multi-car garages and sweeping architectural lines. But to Natalie, the silence felt oppressive. It was a sterile, isolated world where a scream could easily get lost behind thick double-paned glass and heavy velvet curtains. She parked her Subaru behind a line of perfectly trimmed hedges at the Vance estate. The house was a massive Tudor-style mansion with leaded glass windows and a slate roof. Eleanor had given her carte blanche to inspect the grounds, specifically the back patio where Arthur's life had supposedly come to a tragic, clumsy end. Walking around the side of the house, Natalie pulled a pair of blue nitrile gloves from the pocket of her leather jacket and snapped them on. The sharp thwack of the rubber against her wrists was a comforting, familiar ritual. It meant the civilian was checking out, and the doctor was clocking in. The back patio was a sprawling expanse of imported Italian flagstone. The police had removed the yellow tape, and the relentless Seattle drizzle had long since washed away any chalk outlines or blood. But Natalie didn't need tape to see the scene. She had the crime scene photos burned into her eidetic memory. She walked over to the spot where Arthur's body had been found. She looked up. 20 feet above her was the roofline and the aluminum gutters he was supposedly cleaning. Natalie frowned. She walked over to the garden shed, retrieved the exact aluminum extension ladder from the police report, and set it up against the wall. She stepped back, tilting her head. Rule number 1 of emergency medicine, Natalie muttered to herself. The mechanism of injury must match the trauma. Arthur was a heavy-set man of 71. According to the police, the ladder had slipped on the wet stone, causing him to fall backward. But looking at the angle, if a man of his weight fell from that height, the ladder would have kicked out violently in the opposite direction. In the crime scene photos, the ladder was lying almost parallel to his body. It didn't fall with him, it looked like it had been dropped next to him. And then there were the gutters themselves. Natalie climbed the first 5 rungs of the ladder. Testing its stability, she looked closely at the edge of the roof. High-end, micro-mesh gutter guards. They were completely enclosed. No leaves could get in. Why would a wealthy, 71-year-old man who was famously terrified of heights climb a wet ladder at 7 in the morning to clean gutters that literally did not require cleaning? He wouldn't. Natalie climbed back down, her mind racing. She began to walk the perimeter of the patio, moving away from the kill zone and examining the surrounding landscaping. If Arthur was suffocated first, there had to be a struggle. A man fighting for his last breath doesn't go quietly, no matter how old he is. She dropped to her knees near a thick cluster of hydrangeas bordering the stone patio. She ignored the damp soil seeping through her jeans. Her eyes scanned the ground, moving inch by inch. Broken twigs, a patch of mulch that was slightly more compressed than the rest. She pulled a small tactical flashlight from her jacket and clicked it on, angling the beam across the soil. There, deep in the bushes, hidden from the casual glance of a lazy detective, a single, expensive landscaping light was tilted at a jagged 45-degree angle. The glass housing was cracked. Natalie reached in carefully. Snagged on the jagged edge of the broken glass was a tiny, almost microscopic thread of black fabric. It wasn't cotton. It looked like high-tensile synthetic fiber, the kind used in tactical gear or professional climbing gloves. Well, Natalie whispered, using a pair of tweezers to carefully place the fiber into a small plastic evidence bag. You aren't a ghost after all. You shouldn't be disturbing a closed scene. Cross. Natalie didn't jump. Her military training had conditioned her to suppress the startle reflex. She slowly stood up, slipping the evidence bag into her pocket before turning around. Standing on the patio was a man in a rumpled tan trench coat over a cheap suit. He held a half-empty cup of gas station coffee in one hand and looked at her with a mixture of annoyance and weary condescension. "Detective Reynolds," Natalie said, her voice smooth as glass. "I didn't realize the Seattle PD did house calls for closed cases. Especially on a Tuesday morning." Detective Mark Reynolds took a sip of his coffee and grimaced. He was a veteran cop. The kind who relied more on his gut and a quick closure rate than meticulous forensics. "Mrs. Vance called the precinct complaining that we missed something. My captain told me to come out here and smooth things over with the grieving widow. Imagine my surprise when I find a private eye digging in the dirt. Maybe if your CSU had dug in the dirt a little more, I wouldn't have to," Natalie countered, stepping onto the patio to face him. Reynolds sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, Doc, I know your background. Honorable discharge, Silver Star, saved a lot of good boys overseas. I respect the hell out of that. But you aren't in a combat zone anymore. This is a wealthy suburb. And old men slip and fall. It's a tragedy, not a conspiracy." He had petechial hemorrhaging, Mark, Natalie said, her tone sharpening, dropping the formalities, and defensive bruising on his forearms. "I saw the coroner's photos. You and I both know those aren't injuries consistent with a 20-foot vertical drop." Reynolds' jaw tightened. He was on heavy blood thinners for a heart condition. The coroner signed off on it. The bruising was from hitting the ladder on the way down, and the hemorrhaging was a post-mortem anomaly due to blood pooling in the head trauma. "That is the biggest pile of medical garbage I've ever heard. And you know it," Natalie shot back, taking a step closer. The air between them crackled with tension. Arthur Vance was smothered, and he wasn't the first. Marcus Sterling, Sarah Jenkins, all wealthy. All in this neighborhood. All tragic accidents in the last 6 months. Reynolds pointed a thick finger at her. "Careful, Cross. You're stringing together coincidences to milk a grieving widow for a paycheck. You start making noise about a serial killer in Oakwood Estates. The mayor's office will come down on my department like a ton of bricks. And I will personally make sure your pie license is revoked before lunchtime. Natalie looked at his pointing finger. Then met his eyes. Her gaze was cold, empty. The gaze of a woman who had stared down warlords. Reynolds actually took a half step back. I don't care about the mayor. Detective, Natalie said quietly. And I don't scare easily. Someone is treating this neighborhood like a hunting ground. If you want to look the other way because it's easier, fine, but I'm going to find whoever is doing this. She walked past him, her shoulder lightly brushing his. Oh, and Mark, she called out without looking back. Next time you close a case, maybe check if the victim actually needed to clean his gutters. Leaving the detective fuming in the rain, Natalie got back into her Subaru. She pulled the plastic bag holding the black thread from her pocket and placed it on the passenger seat. The killer was smart. They had bypassed security, staged a perfect accident, and fooled the police, but they had made a mistake in the bushes. A physical struggle meant physical evidence. Natalie started the engine. She needed to know who else in Oakwood Estates was on the Homeowners Association board. Because if Arthur Vance, Marcus Sterling, and Sarah Jenkins were connected by more than just a zip code, she had to figure out who the killer's next target was. Before they had another tragic accident. The transition from the manicured silence of Oakwood Estates to the relentless, gritty hum of downtown Seattle always gave Natalie a slight case of whiplash. By 3:30 p.m., she was no longer the sharp-eyed investigator staring down a homicide detective. She was just another tired mom double parked in front of Lincoln Elementary, waiting for the bell to ring. When Cole climbed into the backseat of the Subaru, dragging a backpack that looked half his size, the heavy knot of tension in Natalie's chest finally loosened. "Hey, buddy, how was school?" she asked, adjusting the rearview mirror to catch his eye. "Marcus traded me his limited edition Galaxy trading card for my juice box," Cole announced proudly, holding up a shiny piece of cardboard. "Best trade ever. Oh, and Mrs. Gable said I need to practice my fractions." "We can tackle fractions after dinner." Natalie smiled, putting the car in drive. "Macaroni and cheese tonight? With the little hot dog pieces?" "You know it." The evening routine was a sacred ritual. It was the anchor that kept Natalie from drifting too far into the dark waters of her work. They cooked together, fought over math homework, and read 2 chapters of a fantasy novel before Cole finally surrendered to sleep. Only when his door was shut and the apartment was cloaked in the quiet of the night did Natalie let the armor slip back on. She walked into her makeshift office, turning on the small desk lamp. It cast a pool of yellow light over her computer and the small plastic evidence bag sitting next to the keyboard. Natalie carefully pulled a heavy, matte black microscope from the bottom shelf of her bookcase. It was a high-end Leica model, a graduation gift from her father before he passed, and one of the few expensive things she owned. She slid the tiny, jagged black fiber onto a glass slide and peered through the lens, adjusting the magnification. Not cotton, not polyester. Under the harsh light, the structure of the thread revealed itself. It was a complex, woven matrix, a para-aramid synthetic fiber. Natalie leaned back in her chair, staring at the wall. "Kevlar," she whispered to the empty room. "Blended with Nomex for fire resistance." This wasn't a thread from a common burglar's ski mask or a landscaper's gardening glove. This was military-grade tactical fabric. The kind used in reinforced climbing gear, combat uniforms, or garrots designed not to slip when applying lethal pressure to a human neck. Someone highly trained had been in Arthur Vance's backyard, and Detective Reynolds was blindly writing it off as a slip and fall. Natalie spun her chair back to the computer. She cracked her knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and opened a secure browser. Eleanor Vance had given her access to Arthur's laptop and digital files, including the encrypted folders related to the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. If Arthur Vance, Marcus Sterling, and Sarah Jenkins were all targeted, they had to be connected by more than just proximity. Natalie bypassed the basic security protocols on the HOA's cloud server, a trick she'd picked up from a Navy intelligence officer in Kandahar, and started downloading the meeting minutes from the past 12 months. Her eyes scanned the dense, bureaucratic text, disputes over hedge heights, complaints about pool contractors, debates on repaving the private roads. Nothing to kill over. "Come on," she muttered, taking a sip of lukewarm coffee. "What ties a retired CEO, a real estate mogul, and an heiress together?" She ran a cross-reference search with the 3 victims' names. The screen blinked, filtering out hundreds of pages until it landed on a specific, heated subcommittee meeting from exactly 7 months ago. The Western Ridge Expansion Project. Natalie leaned closer to the monitor, her heart rate ticking up. A massive commercial developer, Horizon Dynamics, had quietly put in a bid to purchase a 300-acre parcel of pristine, forested land directly bordering the back wall of Oakwood Estates. They wanted to build a luxury resort and casino. The residents of Oakwood were furious. The traffic, the noise, the destruction of their exclusive privacy. It was a nightmare scenario for the 1%. The WA had the legal power to block the zoning permits required for the sale to go through, thanks to an old, obscure city ordinance. Natalie pulled up the voting records from that night. To block the development, the WA needed a unanimous vote from its 5-person executive board. Vote 1. Arthur Vance voted yes to block. Vote 2. Marcus Sterling voted yes to block. Vote 3. Sarah Jenkins voted yes to block. Natalie felt the cold prickle of adrenaline wash over her. It wasn't a serial killer stalking the suburbs for thrills. It was a corporate assassination ring. Horizon Dynamics stood to make hundreds of millions of dollars on the casino. A few million paid to a professional hitman to systematically eliminate the opposition and stage them as accidents was just the cost of doing business. And with the opposition dying off, the WA board would be forced to bring in new, likely bought-off, members. Natalie looked back at the screen. She needed the names of the last 2 board members. Vote 4. Richard Sterling, Marcus's brother, voted no to block. Richard was in favor of the casino. Probably paid off. That meant he was safe. Natalie scrolled down, her breath catching in her throat. Vote 5. Elias Thorne voted yes to block. 3 yes votes were dead. Murdered with chilling precision. Elias Thorne was the last man standing in the way of a billion-dollar deal. And he didn't even know he had a target painted on his back. Natalie quickly typed Elias Thorne's name into the search bar. Retired architect, 68 years old, lives at 4410 Crestview Drive, Oakwood Estates. She glanced at the clock on her desk. It was 11:45 p.m. The killer was efficient. They wouldn't wait long after Arthur Vance's accident to finish the job. With the police looking the other way, the hitman had an open field. Tonight was raining. The skies were pitch black. It was the perfect weather for a ghost to slip over the gates of Oakwood Estates. Natalie stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward and hitting the bookshelf. She walked to the center of the room, pulled back the small rug, and entered a 6-digit code into the biometric floor safe. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside sat her Glock 19, 2 spare magazines, and a tactical flashlight. She hadn't carried the weapon on a civilian job in over a year. She hated the weight of it. She hated what it represented. But she remembered the Kevlar thread. She remembered the professional brutality of Arthur Vance's murder. If she was going to save Elias Thorne tonight, she couldn't show up with just a badge and a stern warning. Natalie loaded the magazine, the metallic click-clack a harsh reminder of a life she thought she had left behind in the desert. She holstered the weapon at the small of her back and pulled on her dark leather jacket. She walked over to Cole's room one last time. She gently pushed the door open. He was sound asleep. The blankets kicked off again. She silently stepped in, pulled the covers up to his chin, and kissed his forehead. "I'll be back before you wake up, superhero," she whispered. Natalie locked the apartment door behind her and headed out into the Seattle rain. She was done playing the polite private investigator. Tonight, the doctor was out, and the soldier was stepping back onto the battlefield. The drive back to Oakwood Estates was a blur of sweeping windshield wipers and neon reflections on the slick Seattle asphalt. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed 12:42 a.m. The city was asleep, but the adrenaline singing in Natalie's veins made her feel violently awake. She didn't take the main entrance. The kid in the guardhouse had logged her license plate once today. She wasn't going to give Detective Reynolds the satisfaction of placing her at the scene of another accident. Instead, she parked her Subaru half a mile down a muddy logging road that ran parallel to the estate's heavily wooded perimeter. Stepping out into the freezing downpour, Natalie pulled the hood of her dark, water-resistant jacket over her head. She checked the chamber of her Glock 19, feeling the cold, reassuring weight of the steel, and slipped it back into the holster at her lower back. The perimeter wall of Oakwood Estates was 10 feet of solid masonry, topped with decorative iron spikes and motion sensor cameras. For a wealthy suburbanite, it was an impenetrable fortress. For a former Army Ranger support specialist who had navigated the heavily fortified compounds of hostile territories, it was a minor inconvenience. Natalie found a blind spot where an ancient, overgrown oak tree shadowed the camera's sweeping arc. With practiced agility, she scaled the rough bark, stepped onto a sturdy branch, and vaulted silently over the wall, landing softly in the wet grass on the other side. She was in, navigating by memory and the faint glow of the estate's ambient lighting. She moved through the sprawling backyards, using manicured hedges and pool cabanas as cover. 4410 Crestview Drive was a modern, glass and steel architectural marvel that sat at the edge of the community. Bordering the very woods Horizon Dynamics wanted to bulldoze. As Natalie approached the rear of Elias Thorne's property, her combat instincts flared. The house was completely dark. Too dark, even at 1 a.m. A house of this size should have had landscape lighting or a security porch light activated. Natalie crouched behind a stone fire pit, her eyes scanning the sleek, multi-level patio. There, the heavy glass sliding door leading into the sunken living room was slightly ajar. Natalie drew her weapon. She didn't announce herself. She didn't call the police. Reynolds wouldn't get here in time. And if he did, he'd probably trip the sirens and get Thorne killed instantly. She slipped through the open door, her rubber-soled boots making zero sound on the polished hardwood floors. The air inside the house was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of expensive cigars and lemon polish. But beneath that, Natalie's heightened senses caught something else. The faint, metallic tang of ozone, the smell of a freshly bypassed electronic lock. The killer was already inside. Natalie transitioned into a tactical glide, keeping her weapon raised, tracking the muzzle with her eyes. She moved through the cavernous living room and towards the grand staircase. The house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. As she reached the second-floor landing, she heard it, a sound so soft it was almost a vibration, the faint squeak of a rubber sole shifting weight on a carpeted floor. It came from the master bedroom at the end of the hall. Natalie pressed her back against the corridor wall, edging closer to the open bedroom door. She angled her head, catching a reflection in a large decorative mirror hanging in the hallway. Inside the room, Elias Thorne, an older man with a shock of white hair, was asleep in a massive king-sized bed. Standing over him was a silhouette wrapped entirely in black tactical gear. The intruder was holding a small, clear medical syringe, the needle glinting menacingly in the ambient light from the window. Potassium chloride, Natalie thought instantly, her medical training identifying the weapon of choice. It would stop an older man's heart in seconds. And without a highly specific toxicology screen, which Reynolds wouldn't order, it would look exactly like a massive, natural heart attack in his sleep. The intruder raised the syringe, aiming for the exposed vein in Thorne's neck. Natalie stepped into the doorway, her Glock leveled squarely at center mass. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. It wasn't a request, it was an absolute, cold-blooded order. The intruder froze, but only for a fraction of a second. They didn't panic. They didn't put their hands up. Instead, with terrifying speed, the figure threw a heavy, silver object right at Natalie's face and lunged. Natalie ducked, the heavy silver humidor smashing into the doorframe behind her, showering her in splinters. By the time she brought her weapon back up, the killer was already on her. A gloved hand clamped over the slide of her Glock, pushing it upward while a knee drove viciously into her stomach. The air exploded from Natalie's lungs. The gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling, the deafening crack echoing like a cannon in the confined space. Thorne bolted upright in bed, screaming in terror. "Run, Thorne! Get out!" Natalie gasped, grappling with the attacker. The killer was incredibly strong and heavily trained. They moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a professional operator. A serrated combat knife suddenly appeared in the intruder's left hand, slashing upward in a deadly arc aimed at Natalie's throat. Natalie fell back on her army combatives training. She blocked the knife arm with her forearm, ignoring the bruising impact, and twisted her hips, using the attacker's own momentum against them. She drove her elbow hard into the brachial plexus, a bundle of nerves at the side of the killer's neck. The attacker grunted in pain, the knife dropping to the thick carpet. But they didn't retreat. The killer spun, landing a punishing roundhouse kick to Natalie's ribs. She heard a sickening crack and tasted copper. She stumbled backward, crashing into a heavy oak dresser, her gun sliding across the floor. The intruder glanced at the screaming Elias Thorne, then at the dropped syringe, and finally at Natalie, who was already pushing herself off the floor, eyes blazing with furious defiance, reaching for a heavy brass lamp. The killer made a calculated tactical decision. The stealth mission was blown. The gunshot would bring the estate security and the police within minutes. The target was awake, and the obstacle, Natalie, was refusing to stay down. Without a word, the shadow turned, sprinted toward the massive plate glass window, and launched themselves through it. Glass exploded outward in a spectacular shower of deadly rain. Natalie ran to the shattered window, ignoring the searing pain in her ribs, and looked down. The killer had rolled perfectly onto the awning below, dropping into the dark, rain-soaked hedges, and vanished into the night like a ghost. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Oakwood Estates was waking up. Natalie turned back to the room. Elias Thorne was backed into the corner of his bed, clutching his chest, hyperventilating. Who are you?" he stammered, his eyes wide with shock, looking from the shattered window to the woman bleeding onto his expensive carpet. Natalie picked up her Glock and holstered it. She walked over to the dropped syringe and carefully kicked it under the edge of the bed where the crime scene investigators would have to find it. She looked at Thorne, wiping a streak of blood from her cheek. "I'm the reason you're going to see tomorrow. Mr. Thorne, when the police get here, tell them exactly what happened. Tell them someone tried to stop your heart." "But who? Why?" "Because of the Horizon Dynamics vote," Natalie said grimly, holding her ribs. "You were the last no-vote standing. Do not drink anything, do not eat anything, and do not leave police custody until you hire private security." The sirens were getting louder. Red and blue lights began to pulse against the rainy sky, reflecting off the shattered glass on the floor. "What about you?" Thorne asked, trembling. "The police. I was never here," Natalie said. She stepped out of the bedroom, moving quickly despite the sharp pain radiating through her torso. She had to get back over that wall into her Subaru before Reynolds and his uniforms locked down the perimeter. The ghost had escaped tonight, but they had left a trail, and Dr. Natalie Cross was going to hunt them down. Every breath Natalie took on the drive back to her apartment felt like swallowing shards of broken glass. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape over the walls of Oakwood Estates was rapidly burning off, leaving behind a cold, nauseating ache in her right side. She parked her Subaru down the street from her building, moving with stiff, mechanical precision as she climbed the 2 flights of stairs. It was 2:15 a.m. Unlocking the door with a quiet click, she immediately listened for Cole. Only the steady, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator greeted her. He was still fast asleep. Natalie let out a shaky sigh, the relief almost making her knees buckle. She bypassed her office and headed straight for the small, sterile bathroom, flipping on the harsh overhead light. Natalie gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, staring at her reflection. Her face was pale, a thin cut weeping blood along her cheekbone, her blonde hair plastered to her skull by the Seattle rain. She stripped off her soaked leather jacket and pulled up her black t-shirt. Her lower right ribcage was already blooming into a vicious, mottled tapestry of black and deep purple. The civilian instinct is to wrap broken ribs tightly in an ace bandage or athletic tape. Dr. Natalie Cross knew better. Taping restricts the expansion of the lungs. turning a simple fracture into a breeding ground for pneumonia. 2 ribs. Cracked, not displaced, she muttered, gently palpating the bone structure with her fingertips. The sharp, localized agony confirmed her diagnosis. She opened the mirrored medicine cabinet, a veritable pharmacy of field medic supplies. She cleaned the cut on her cheek with a chlorhexidine wipe, ignoring the sharp sting, and sealed it flawlessly with a bead of surgical glue. For her ribs, she peeled the backing off a prescription-strength lidocaine patch and applied it directly over the darkest bruising, followed by swallowing 800 milligrams of ibuprofen. She needed to remain sharp. The pain was just data, she could compartmentalize it. After changing into dry sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, Natalie limped back to her office desk. She didn't turn on the overhead light, preferring the solitary glow of her computer monitor. The ghost in Elias Thorne's bedroom wasn't a random street thug. Natalie mentally replayed the 3-minute fight, breaking it down frame by frame like a piece of tactical film. The intruder hadn't flinched when she drew her weapon. They had thrown a heavy object to trigger her flinch response, immediately closed the distance to neutralize the firearm, and transitioned to a lethal blade strike in less than 2 seconds. Krav Maga mixed with Sistema, Natalie analyzed, rubbing her temples. Russian military martial arts combined with Israeli close-quarters combat. Brutal, efficient, no wasted movement. You didn't learn that in a local dojo. You learned that in special operations. Natalie pulled the keyboard closer, her fingers flying across the keys. She needed to know exactly who she was dealing with. If Horizon Dynamics was willing to hire a ghost to wipe out an WA board, they were playing a dangerous, high-stakes game. She brought up the encrypted files from Arthur Vance's computer again. Horizon Dynamics, a massive real estate development conglomerate based out of Chicago, with deep pockets and a reputation for aggressive expansion. But a corporate developer doesn't just have black ops assassins on speed dial. There had to be an intermediary. Where do you get your ghosts? Horizon? She whispered, bypassing their public-facing corporate website and digging into their SEC filings and subsidiary acquisitions. She followed the money, millions of dollars flowing from Horizon's main accounts into a maze of LLCs and offshore holdings. It took her an hour of relentless, digital excavation to find the anomaly. A massive retainer fee, paid monthly, to a company called Apex Vanguard Solutions. Natalie opened a new tab and ran a background search on Apex Vanguard. The public website was slick, corporate, and incredibly vague. Global risk management, executive protection, strategic security consulting. But when Natalie dug into the executive board of Apex Vanguard, the blood in her veins ran ice cold. The CEO was a man named Thomas Vance. Natalie stopped breathing. She stared at the name, the cursor blinking mockingly on the screen. Vance. Arthur Vance. The first victim. The man whose grieving widow, Eleanor, had hired Natalie just 14 hours ago. Could it be a coincidence? She hacked into the Washington State Public Records database, pulling Arthur Vance's family tree. Thomas Vance wasn't a coincidence. He was Arthur Vance's estranged son from his first marriage, a former Navy SEAL who had been dishonorably discharged for excessive use of force in Fallujah, who then took his skills to the private sector and built a mercenary empire. The pieces fell into place with terrifying, sickening clarity. This wasn't just about Horizon Dynamics wanting to build a casino. Richard Sterling, the WA board member who voted for the casino, had orchestrated the murder of his own brother, Marcus. To clear the path, and to execute the plan, Richard had hired Apex Vanguard. Thomas Vance had accepted the contract, and his first target, the first obstacle to remove, had been his own father, Arthur. Eleanor didn't know. The grieving widow had hired Natalie to find her husband's killer, completely unaware that the call had come from inside the family. Suddenly, Natalie's burner phone, the one she kept for secure client communications, vibrated violently on the desk. The sudden noise made her jump, sending a fresh spike of agony through her ribs. She looked at the screen. Unknown caller. It was 3:45 a.m. Natalie picked it up, pressing it to her ear but saying nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and predatory. "You have excellent reaction time for a civilian, Dr. Cross," a voice said. It was male, electronically modulated, but the sheer arrogance bled through the distortion. Natalie's grip on the phone tightened. It was him, the ghost from the bedroom. "I'm not a civilian," Natalie replied, her voice eerily calm, the ice-cold exterior of the soldier sliding perfectly into place. "And you left your syringe behind." Sloppy work for an Apex Vanguard operator. A low chuckle echoed through the receiver. "You're a smart woman, too smart for your own good. Elias Thorne survived tonight, but the contract is still open. And now, unfortunately, your name has been added to the ledger." "I've had a target on my back before," Natalie said, her green eyes locked onto the dark window. "I'm still here." "Yes, but you were in the desert back then, Major," the voice purred, dropping the modulation for a brief, chilling second to reveal a smooth, lethal tone. "You didn't have a little boy sleeping in the next room. What's his name again? Cole?" The world stopped spinning. The air in the room vanished. A wave of maternal terror, so primal and violent it felt like a physical blow, slammed into Natalie's chest. "If you come anywhere near my son," Natalie whispered, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, homicidal promise, "I won't just kill you. I will take you apart piece by piece. See you soon, Doctor." Click. The line went dead. Natalie slowly lowered the phone. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had poked the bear. And the bear had just threatened the only thing in the world she loved. She turned off the computer monitor, plunging the room into darkness. She walked quietly into Cole's room, watching his chest rise and fall in peaceful slumber. They couldn't stay here. The apartment was a glass box, and the hunters knew exactly where it was. Natalie went to her closet and pulled out 2 heavy canvas duffel bags. The investigation had just ended. This was no longer a case about a grieving widow or a corrupt Wa. This was war, and Dr. Natalie Cross was about to show Apex Vanguard exactly why she had earned a Silver Star. By 4 a.m., the apartment was no longer a home. It was a compromised tactical position. Natalie moved through the shadows with silent, agonizing efficiency, her bruised ribs protesting every twist and bend. In her bedroom, she dragged a heavy, reinforced Pelican case from beneath her bed. She hadn't opened it since the day her honorable discharge papers arrived in the mail. She popped the dual latches. The scent of gun oil, compressed canvas, and sterile medical packaging drifted into the air, the perfume of her past life. Inside was her go bag. Every operator had one. It was a paranoid habit, a survival mechanism born from living in war zones where your base could be overrun at any moment. She quickly inventoried the contents, $10,000 in untraceable vacuum-sealed cash, 3 prepaid burner phones, a level IAIA Kevlar vest, a trauma kit equipped with quick-clotting sponges and tourniquets, and a disassembled Sig Sauer MPX submachine gun with 4 fully loaded magazines of hollow-point ammunition. She snapped the MPX together in the dark, her hands moving purely on muscle memory. Click, clack. The mechanical sounds were terrifyingly loud in the quiet apartment. But to Natalie, they were a symphony of control. She wasn't a victim. She was the storm they had just invited into their lives. She slung the tactical bag over her shoulder and walked into her office. She couldn't leave Apex Vanguard any breadcrumbs. She grabbed a small thermite charge from her safe, a simple incendiary compound, and placed it squarely on top of her computer's hard drive stack. She set the digital timer for exactly 30 minutes. In half an hour, her digital footprint, the case files, and all her research on horizon dynamics would be reduced to a pool of molten slag. Finally, she walked into Cole's room. The hardest part of war was never the violence, it was the collateral damage to innocence. Natalie knelt beside his bed, listening to his soft, rhythmic breathing. Her heart ached so fiercely it rivaled the pain in her ribs. She gently placed a warm hand on his shoulder. "Cole," she whispered, keeping her voice incredibly soft, devoid of any panic. "Hey, superhero. Time to wake up." Cole groaned, burying his face deeper into his stuffed bear. "Mom, is it morning?" he mumbled, his eyes still glued shut. "Not quite, buddy," Natalie said, stroking his messy hair. She forced a bright, conspiratorial smile onto her face. "But we have a problem. I got a call from the agency. We've been activated for a secret, early morning training mission." That got his attention. Cole's green eyes blinked open, instantly wide with the pure, unadulterated excitement of an 8-year-old boy. "A secret mission? Like spies?" "Exactly like spies," Natalie whispered, tapping his nose. "But rule number 1 of spy school: we have to be completely invisible. That means moving fast, packing light, and absolutely no talking once we leave the apartment. Can you do that?" Cole sat up straight, nodding vigorously, his sleepiness vanishing. "I'm ready, Major Mom." "Good man. Get your backpack. Only the essentials. 2 changes of clothes, your toothbrush, and Captain Bear. 2 minutes. Go." While Cole scrambled in the dark to pack his small backpack, Natalie moved to the front door of the apartment. She wasn't just going to run. She wanted Thomas Vance to know exactly who he was dealing with. She pulled a military-grade M84 stun grenade, a flashbang, from her tactical vest. She carefully pulled the pin, holding the spoon down, and wedged it tightly between the doorframe and the heavy wooden door. She rigged a thin piece of high-tensile fishing line from the spoon to the doorknob. It was a crude, old-school booby trap, but brutally effective. If Apex Vanguard sent a hit squad to breach her front door, the moment they kicked it open, the spoon would fly off. The resulting explosion wouldn't kill them, but 170 decibels of deafening noise and a blinding flash of 7 million candela would rupture their eardrums, fry their retinas, and leave them vomiting on the hallway floor. "Mom, I'm ready," Cole whispered, appearing in the hallway. He had his backpack strapped on tight. Captain Bear clutched firmly in his left hand. He looked at the heavy black rifles slung across his mother's back, his eyes widening slightly. "Are the bad guys coming?" "Not if we leave right now," Natalie said, kneeling to look him in the eye. "You trust me?" Always, he whispered. All right, stick to my shadow. At 4:20 a.m., Natalie didn't use the front door. She led Cole down the narrow hallway to the kitchen, opening the window that led out to the rusty iron fire escape. The Seattle rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick, freezing fog that blanketed the alleyway below. They climbed down the metal grate stairs in complete silence. Natalie's eyes scanned every shadow, every parked car, her hand resting comfortably on the grip of her Glock. When their boots hit the wet pavement of the alley, Natalie didn't head for her Subaru Outback parked on the street. Thomas Vance was a professional. He would have run her license plates and likely put a GPS tracker on her daily driver the moment she left Oakwood Estates. Instead, she grabbed Cole's hand and led him 2 blocks down the alley, weaving through dumpsters and chain-link fences until they reached a dilapidated, graffiti-covered block of private storage garages. Natalie punched a code into the keypad of Unit 42. The corrugated metal door groaned upward. Sitting inside was a jet-black 2018 Ford Explorer. It looked completely ordinary from the outside. The kind of SUV driven by 1,000 soccer moms in the Pacific Northwest. But it wasn't ordinary. Natalie had bought it at a government auction. It had reinforced suspension, bullet-resistant glass, and run-flat tires. It was her insurance policy. She opened the heavy passenger door. Get in the back, buddy. Keep your head below the windows until I say so. Cole scrambled into the backseat, buckling himself in without a word. He was playing the spy game perfectly, though Natalie could see the faint tremor of anxiety in his small hands. She threw her Pelican case into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and hit the ignition. The powerful V6 engine purred to life with a quiet, suppressed hum. Natalie pulled the Explorer out of the garage, hitting a button on her visor to close the door behind them. As she navigated the quiet, foggy streets, steering clear of main intersections and traffic cameras, she checked her watch. 4:35 a.m. Back in her apartment building, a sleek, black van with tinted windows rolled silently to a stop across the street. 4 men dressed in dark, in-branded tactical gear stepped out into the fog. They moved with the terrifying synchronization of an elite hit squad, stacking up outside the main entrance of Natalie's building. The leader, a massive man carrying a suppressed carbine, signaled his team. They breached the front door of the complex and moved up the stairs toward Natalie's floor. 2 miles away, cruising onto the southbound on-ramp of Interstate 5, Natalie looked in her rearview mirror. Cole had laid his head against his backpack and fallen back asleep, exhausted by the adrenaline. Natalie gripped the leather steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She was leaving her home, her life, and her business behind, but as the dark, sprawling silhouette of Seattle faded in the rearview mirror, she didn't feel fear. She felt an overwhelming, icy resolve. Suddenly, a dull, concussive thump echoed in the far distance, barely audible over the hum of the highway, followed immediately by the faint wail of a fire alarm. Natalie allowed herself a grim, razor-thin smile. Boom! The thermite had done its job, and the flashbang had welcomed her guests. Apex Vanguard now knew the apartment was empty, and they knew they had severely underestimated Dr. Natalie Cross. "Sleep well, Cole," Natalie whispered into the quiet cabin of the SUV, stepping heavily on the accelerator. "Because when the sun comes up, Mommy has to go to war." The neon glow of Seattle had long since bled out in the rearview mirror. replaced by the towering, jagged silhouettes of the Cascade Mountains. As the first pale streaks of dawn bruised the eastern sky, Natalie steered the heavy Ford Explorer off the smooth asphalt of Interstate 90 and onto a deeply rutted, unmarked logging road. The heavy tires crunched over gravel and fallen pine branches. The air out here was different, sharp, biting, and smelling of damp earth and ancient cedar. "Mom," a small voice called from the backseat. Natalie glanced in the rearview mirror. Cole was rubbing his eyes, looking out the tinted window at the dense, impenetrable wall of trees. The spy game adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a confused, hungry 8-year-old. "Hey, buddy, did you get some sleep?" Natalie asked, keeping her voice light, masking the agonizing throb in her broken ribs. "Yeah, where are we? Are we still on the secret mission?" "We are." Natalie smiled, reaching into the passenger seat and tossing a foil-wrapped protein bar into the back. "Breakfast of champions. Eat up. We're going to visit an old friend of mine. Someone who knows a lot about staying invisible." The road twisted higher into the mountains, the cell service dropping from 2 bars to nothing. Exactly as planned, after another grueling 40 minutes of navigating switchbacks, the dense tree line finally broke, revealing a small, rugged clearing overlooking a mist-filled valley. Nestled against the sheer rock face was a heavy timber cabin. It looked rustic, almost abandoned, but Natalie's trained eyes caught the glint of a solar panel array camouflaged on the roof. The reinforced steel plating behind the wooden window shutters, and the subtle, perfectly placed motion sensors disguised as birdhouses. Before Natalie even cut the engine, the heavy oak front door swung open. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, built like a brick wall, wearing a faded flannel shirt and heavy work boots. A thick, unkempt beard obscured half his face, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, and locked dead onto the SUV, slung casually over his right shoulder, but positioned for an instant draw, was a custom-built AR-10 designated marksman rifle. Cole gasped, shrinking back into his seat. "Mom, he has a gun." "It's okay, Cole. That's Uncle Jax. He's one of the good guys." Natalie stepped out of the Explorer, leaving her hands empty and in plain sight. She walked slowly toward the porch. Jax Miller had been the lead combat engineer in Natalie's unit in Afghanistan. He was a man who could build a bridge out of scrap metal or level a city block with a pound of C4. 3 years ago, Natalie had spent 6 agonizing hours operating on him in a sandstorm, pulling shrapnel out of his femoral artery to save his leg, and his life. Jax's hard eyes softened as he recognized the blonde hair and the familiar, determined stride. He lowered the rifle, leaning it against the porch railing. "You're a long way from the city, Major," Jax said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. His eyes quickly scanned her, immediately catching the stiff way she held her right arm against her torso. "And you look like hell. You should see the door I left behind," Natalie replied, a tired, genuine smile cracking her stoic facade. She walked up the steps, and the giant man pulled her into a careful, one-armed hug. "I need a favor, Jax." "A big one." Jax looked past her to the Explorer, watching Cole press his face against the glass. He sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken understanding. "If you brought the kid, it means the ghosts are out of the bottle. Get inside. I'll pull the truck around back and sweep our 6." 10 minutes later, Cole was happily set up in a corner of the cabin's living room, a vintage comic book in his lap and a mug of hot cocoa in his hands. The roaring fire in the stone hearth pushed the mountain chill away. In the back room, a space that looked less like a bedroom and more like a tactical command center, Natalie unzipped her Pelican case on a heavy wooden table. Jax tossed a medical kit onto the table next to her weapons. "Sit," Jax ordered. "Let me look at those ribs." "I already patched them." "Jax, lidocaine and tape." "I'm fine." "I didn't ask," he grunted, physically pressing her into a chair. As a medic, she hated being the patient, but she knew better than to argue with him. Jax carefully lifted the hem of her shirt, his jaw tightening as he saw the massive, ugly purple bruising spreading across her flank. "Boot or blunt instrument?" he asked quietly. "Both." Natalie winced as his calloused fingers prodded the bone. "He threw a humidor at me to blind my draw. Then closed the distance. Krav Maga mixed with Systema. He was fast." "Jax. Unbelievably fast." Jax pulled a fresh roll of medical tape and began wrapping her torso tightly, but with expert care to allow her lungs to expand. "Who are we fighting, Nat?" Natalie looked up, her green eyes hardening into chips of emerald ice. "Apex Vanguard." Jax froze. The roll of tape stopped midair. "Thomas Vance's outfit? The private military contractors?" "They aren't contractors, Jax. They're a hit squad wrapped in a corporate tax bracket. Horizon Dynamics hired them to wipe out the Oakwood Estates WA board to clear a real estate deal. I walked into the middle of their last hit, saved the target, and poked Thomas Vance right in the eye." Natalie stood up, ignoring the stiffness in her side, and pulled her Sig Sauer MPX from the case. She slammed a magazine into the well with a sharp, violent click. "Vance called my secure line. He threatened Cole. Jax. He threatened my son." Jax's expression went completely blank. For a combat veteran, that lack of emotion was the most dangerous look of all. It meant the safety switch was off. He walked over to a heavy steel gun safe in the corner of the room and spun the dial. "Vance is a ghost," Jax said, pulling out a bandolier of specialized ammunition. "He operates out of a fortified compound on Mercer Island. State-of-the-art security, biometric locks, and 24 ex-Special Forces operators guarding the perimeter. You can't just knock on his door. Natalie, it's a suicide mission." "I'm not going to knock," Natalie said coldly, spreading a topographical map of Seattle and the surrounding waterways across the table. "I'm going to burn his house down." She pointed a finger at a specific dock on the map, located on the eastern edge of Mercer Island. "Vance is arrogant," Natalie explained, her analytical mind operating at light speed. "He thinks I'm running. He thinks I'm a terrified civilian mom hiding in a motel. He won't expect a counterattack. Not today. Not while he's busy trying to clean up the mess his operator left at Elias Thorne's house last night." Jax leaned over the map, tracing the water routes. "So, what's the play? We don't go through the front gates. We go through the water. We hit his servers. If I can extract the financial ledgers connecting Apex Vanguard to Horizon Dynamics and the murders in Oakwood, I can send them to the FBI and the SEC simultaneously. The feds will tear his empire apart before lunch." Natalie looked at Jax, the weight of command settling comfortably onto her shoulders. "But I need you to watch Cole. I can't take him into the fire. And there is no one else on this earth I'd trust to protect him." Jax looked at the map, then out the door toward the living room where Cole was quietly reading. He turned back to Natalie. his eyes fierce and loyal. "The boy is safe here. If anyone comes up that mountain, they won't leave it," Jax promised. He reached into his safe and pulled out 2 sleek, black items, tossing them onto the table. "But you're not going in alone. You take these." Natalie looked down. 2 C4 breaching charges, complete with remote detonators. "If you're going to burn his house down, Major," Jax grinned, a terrifying, wolfish expression, "you might as well do it right." Natalie pocketed the detonators. The hunted had just become the hunter. Thomas Vance had picked a fight with a mother, but he was about to go to war with a soldier. Lake Washington is unforgiving, even on a clear day. The deep waters hold a biting chill. But under the cover of a moonless, fog-choked night, it was a black, freezing abyss. Floating 200 yards off the eastern shore of Mercer Island, Natalie adjusted the bite valve of her closed-circuit rebreather. Unlike standard scuba gear, the military-grade apparatus scrubbed her exhaled carbon dioxide and recycled it, leaving absolutely no bubbles on the surface. To the thermal and sonar scanners sweeping the perimeter of Thomas Vance's estate, she was just another piece of submerged driftwood. She wore a sleek, pitch-black neoprene drysuit, towed behind her, clipped to a heavy-duty carabiner on her utility belt, was a waterproof tactical dry bag containing her MPX submachine gun, a decrypted hard drive, and Jax's C4 breaching charges. "Do it for Cole," she told herself as the numbing cold threatened to seep through the thermal layers of her suit. "Finish this." Natalie kicked her heavy diving fins, propelling herself silently through the murky water toward the glowing, ultra-modern monolith that was the Apex Vanguard compound. It sat on a sprawling piece of waterfront property, disguised as a billionaire's architectural masterpiece of glass and concrete. But beneath the luxury facade, it was a fortified command center. As she closed in on the estate's private dock, the sheer scale of Vance's paranoia became evident. Sunk into the concrete pylons beneath the water were high-frequency sonar emitters. Natalie checked the tactical chronometer on her wrist. 11:42 p.m. Jax had done his part perfectly. 10 minutes ago, from his cabin in the Cascades, he had routed a massive, localized DDoS attack through a proxy server aimed directly at Apex Vanguard's external firewalls. It wouldn't breach their systems, but it would force their security mainframe to briefly prioritize network defense over physical perimeter sensors. She had exactly a 90-second window before the sonar rebooted. Natalie swam hard, her muscles burning as she navigated the maze of wooden and concrete pylons beneath the massive boathouse. She surfaced in the dark, stagnant airspace beneath the main deck, silently pulling herself out of the freezing water and onto a narrow maintenance catwalk. She stripped off the heavy rebreather, her lungs expanding in the damp air. Unzipping the waterproof bag, she pulled out her SIG MPX. Screwing the heavy cylindrical suppressor onto the barrel, she chambered a round with a muted snick, then strapped the C4 detonators to her chest rig. Above her, heavy boots thudded against the wooden planks of the dock. Natalie froze, pressing her back against the wet concrete piling. Above the slats, she could see the beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight slicing through the fog. 2 men. Mainframe is still lagging from that ping flood. A gruff voice complained. Command says keep your eyes peeled. If it's a distraction, someone might be trying the fences. Nobody is coming over the fences. Man, the second voice replied, accompanied by the metallic click of a rifle sling being adjusted. It's a fortress. Probably just some script kiddies messing with the network. Natalie didn't wait for them to walk away. She needed access to the boathouse elevator that led directly to the compound's sub-basement servers. She climbed the rusted maintenance ladder with the silent, fluid grace of a predator. Stopping just beneath the trapdoor leading to the deck, she waited for the heavy footsteps to pass directly overhead. 3, 2, 1. Natalie threw open the trapdoor. The sudden movement caught the rearguard off guard. Before he could raise his rifle or shout, Natalie exploded upward from the hatch. She grabbed the collar of his tactical vest, using his own forward momentum to pull him violently down toward the deck. As he fell, she drove her knee squarely into his sternum, knocking the wind out of him, and instantly locked her forearm around his neck in a flawless carotid sleeper hold. In less than 6 seconds, the blood flow to his brain was restricted. His eyes rolled back, and he went entirely limp. She lowered him silently to the wooden planks. The first guard turned around at the faint scuffling sound. "Hey, what?" Natalie was already a ghost in the fog. She lunged forward, sweeping his legs out from under him. As he crashed onto his back, his finger instinctively tightened on the trigger of his rifle. But Natalie's hand was already there, wedging her thumb behind the trigger guard, preventing the gun from firing. With her other hand, she brought the heavy stock of her MPX down hard against his temple. The guard's eyes went vacant, his head hitting the deck with a dull thud. Natalie stood up, her chest heaving slightly, the adrenaline burning away the freezing chill of the lake. She dragged both unconscious men into the shadows behind a stack of shipping crates and zip-tied their wrists and ankles. "Sorry, boys," she whispered. "Nothing personal." She moved swiftly to the boathouse's reinforced steel door. There was no keyhole, only a biometric thumb scanner and a retinal lens. Natalie pulled a small, specialized decryption module from her pouch, a military-grade slicer she'd bought on the black market years ago. She popped the casing off the scanner and clipped the slicer's alligator leads to the raw data wires. The small screen flashed green. Bypass successful. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy clack. Natalie slipped inside. The interior of the compound was sterile, bathed in the cool blue light of LED floor panels. She bypassed the main living quarters, heading straight down the concrete stairwell toward the sub-basement. This was the nerve center of Apex Vanguard. The server room was massive, humming with the mechanical whir of dozens of cooling fans. Racks of blinking black towers lined the walls, holding the secrets of Horizon Dynamics, the Oakwood Wa murders, and 100 other dirty contracts Thomas Vance had executed. Natalie approached the primary terminal. She plugged in her encrypted flash drive and initiated the root extraction protocol. A progress bar popped up on the monitor. Downloading financial ledgers, 12%, 25%. While the data siphoned, Natalie didn't waste time. She pulled Jax's C4 charges from her rig. She placed one on the primary load-bearing pillar in the center of the room, and the second directly onto the backup power generator. She wired the detonators, linking them to the remote switch in her pocket. If Thomas Vance wanted to play God with people's lives, she was going to bring his temple down on his head. Download 89%, 95%, 100%, complete. Natalie pulled the flash drive, slipping it securely into a waterproof pocket over her heart. She had it. The proof that would dismantle Horizon Dynamics and send Thomas Vance to a federal black site for the rest of his natural life. She turned to leave. Suddenly, the mechanical hum of the servers died. The cool blue LEDs in the room abruptly snapped off, plunging the basement into pitch darkness for a terrifying second. Then, the emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the room in a violent, flashing, crimson red. The heavy steel door at the top of the stairwell slammed shut with a sound like a thunderclap, the magnetic locks sealing her inside. A speaker on the wall crackled to life. I have to admit, Major Cross, the smooth, modulated voice of Thomas Vance echoed through the server room. When my perimeter alarms tripped, I assumed you had sent the police. I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to walk into the lion's den yourself. Natalie raised her MPX, scanning the catwalks above her, her green eyes cold and calculating in the red light. You threatened my son, Vance. You should have known I'd come for you. A mother's love, how tragically predictable. Vance chuckled, the sound dripping with arrogant malice. You have my data. Congratulations, but you're locked in a titanium-reinforced vault, 50 feet below ground. You are never seeing that boy again. Over the intercom, Natalie heard the mechanical whine of a heavy ventilation fan engaging, but it wasn't blowing air. A thick, yellowish gas began pouring from the vents near the ceiling, sinking rapidly toward the floor. Halon gas, a fire suppression system designed to completely eradicate oxygen in the room within 60 seconds. Take a deep breath, Doctor, Vance whispered over the speaker. It's going to be your last. Natalie didn't panic. She looked at the gas, then at the sealed door, and finally down at the C4 detonator resting in her hand. Her thumb caressed the red trigger button. You're wrong about one thing, Vance, Natalie said, her voice completely steady, echoing up toward the hidden microphones. And what's that? Natalie smiled, a fierce, terrifying expression that belonged to a woman who had survived the fires of war. I'm not locked in here with you, she said, pressing the detonator. You're locked in here with me. C4 is not fire, it is pure, concussive geometry. It doesn't just burn, it pushes reality out of its way at 26,000 feet per second. When Natalie's thumb depressed the red trigger, she didn't dive blindly. She threw herself behind the heaviest, liquid-cooled server mainframe in the center of the room, curling into a tight fetal position, covering her ears, and opening her mouth to equalize the pressure. Boom! The world didn't just shake, it shattered. The sound was a physical entity. A massive, invisible fist that punched the air out of the sub-basement. The blast wave hit the titanium-reinforced door, warping the metal outward with a grotesque shriek. The concrete pillar holding the backup generator evaporated into a cloud of pulverized dust and jagged shrapnel. The emergency red lights exploded, raining glass down on the floor. For 5 seconds, there was nothing but a deafening, high-pitched ringing in Natalie's ears and the suffocating taste of concrete dust. But the halon gas system was dead. The explosion had ruptured the ventilation ducts and blown the hermetic seal of the door off its hinges, sucking the deadly, oxygen-starved air out into the corridor. Natalie coughed, tasting blood from a bitten lip. Her broken ribs screamed in agonizing protest. A sharp, stabbing fire that threatened to pull her under. Focus. Move. She forced herself up. The tactical bag with the decrypted flash drive was still secured tightly to her chest rig. Through the thick, swirling gray smoke, she saw the ruined doorway. The heavy steel door was hanging by a single, twisted hinge. She racked the charging handle of her Sig Sauer MPX. the weapon coated in a fine layer of gray dust, and stepped through the smoking breach. Above her, the compound was in absolute chaos. Fire alarms shrieked, a chaotic, piercing wail that masked the sound of her footsteps on the concrete stairs. The DDoS attack Jax had launched, combined with the destruction of the backup generator, had plunged the entire Mercer Island estate into a disorganized blackout. The slick, high-tech fortress was now a dark, smoky battlefield. Exactly the kind of environment a former Army Ranger thrived in. Natalie reached the ground floor. Two Apex Vanguard operators, coughing and waving flashlights through the smoke, were rushing toward the stairwell. They never saw her coming. Natalie stepped out of the shadows. Her MPX raised. Peefed PFFT. Two suppressed rounds caught the first guard center mass in his Kevlar vest, not lethal, but carrying enough kinetic energy to drop him like a stone. Gasping for breath, before the second guard could swing his rifle, Natalie closed the distance. She drove the barrel of her weapon hard into his solar plexus, followed by a vicious elbow strike to the side of his helmet. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he hit the tiles. "Command center," she muttered, her eyes scanning the architectural layout she had memorized. Thomas Vance wouldn't be running. Arrogance tied him to his throne. She moved through the sprawling, glass-walled corridors of the mansion, a silent apex predator hunting in the dark. She neutralized two more guards in the atrium, using the blinding strobes of the fire alarms to mask her movements. Finally, she reached the double oak doors of the executive suite overlooking the black waters of Lake Washington. She didn't breach with her weapon drawn. She knew Vance was waiting. Natalie kicked the right door open and immediately threw herself to the left, rolling across the polished hardwood floor. A deafening roar filled the room as a 3-round burst from a heavy-caliber assault rifle shredded the doorway, turning the expensive oak into flying splinters. "You're a cockroach, Major," Thomas Vance's voice barked from the darkness at the far end of the office. He was standing behind a massive mahogany desk, using it as cover. "I blow my own servers to Kingdom Come, and you still crawl out of the rubble." "Your servers are fine, Tommy," Natalie called out from behind a heavy marble pillar, her breathing controlled, her voice dripping with ice. "But I have your ledgers. Horizon Dynamics. The WA hits. The money trail linking you to your own father's murder." The gunfire stopped. The silence in the room was heavier than the smoke. He was a weak old man who stood in the way of progress. Vance spat, stepping out from behind the desk. He dropped the empty rifle and drew a matte black combat knife, the serrated edge catching the moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "And you are a bleeding heart medic who forgot her place. Hand over the drive. Cross. I'll make it quick." Natalie stepped out from behind the pillar. She didn't raise her MPX. In close quarters against a knife-wielding SEAL, a long gun was a liability. She let it hang on its sling and drew her own blade, a customized, curved karambit knife. "You shouldn't have mentioned my son," she whispered. Vance lunged. He moved with the terrifying, explosive speed of a man engineered for violence. He slashed high, aiming for her throat. Natalie parried, her forearm deflecting his strike. But Vance used the momentum to pivot, driving his knee brutally into her injured ribs. Natalie gasped, her vision flashing white with blinding pain. She stumbled backward, crashing into a glass coffee table, shattering it instantly. Vance was on her in a second, pinning her right arm to the floor. his heavy knee pressing into her chest. He raised his knife, aiming the tip directly at her left eye. "Game over, doctor," he sneered, his face inches from hers. But Natalie wasn't looking at the knife. She was looking at the exposed, pulsing artery on the inside of his right bicep. "First, do no harm," the old medical oath whispered in her mind. "Unless they threaten your child," the mother replied. With a roar of pure, unadulterated fury, Natalie twisted her left hand, bringing the hooked blade of her karambit up in a vicious, tearing arc. She didn't aim for a fatal blow. She aimed for anatomical destruction. The blade caught the brachial artery and the median nerve bundle in his knife arm, severing them cleanly. Vance screamed, a high, guttural sound of pure agony. His hand went numb instantly, the combat knife dropping harmlessly onto the carpet. Before he could react, Natalie bucked her hips, using her legs to flip his unbalanced weight over her head. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the screaming pain in her chest, and delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to his jaw. Vance collapsed against the wall, his arm bleeding heavily, his eyes rolling back in shock. Natalie stood over him, her chest heaving, the bloody karambit gripped tightly in her hand. She looked down at the man who had murdered innocent people for corporate greed. The man who had dared to threaten an 8-year-old boy. The urge to end it right there, to guarantee Cole's safety permanently, was a dark, seductive whisper in her mind. But she was not a murderer. She was Natalie Cross. She reached into her medical pouch, pulled out a military tourniquet, and ruthlessly ratcheted it high on Vance's bleeding arm, cutting off the blood flow. She tightened it until he groaned in pain. "You get to live," Natalie said coldly, staring down at him, "but you're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal supermax cage, wondering when the ghosts of the people you killed are going to come for you." Sirens were wailing in the distance now, echoing across the waters of Lake Washington. Real police, FBI tactical units. Jax had done his job, broadcasting the decrypted ledgers to every major law enforcement agency in the state. Natalie pulled a burner phone from her pocket and dropped it on Vance's chest. The screen displayed an active 911 call. "Tell them Dr. Cross says hello," she whispered. Natalie turned her back on the broken mercenary. She walked toward the shattered window, feeling the cold, damp air of the lake hit her face. Below her, the dark waters waited, offering an escape back into the shadows. She had won the war. Horizon Dynamics was finished. The killer was caught. It was time to go pick up her son. Without looking back, Natalie stepped out into the night air and dove flawlessly into the black water below. The black water of Lake Washington hit Natalie like a physical blow, shocking her system and instantly extinguishing the fire in her lungs. She didn't fight the cold, she embraced it. It washed away the metallic scent of blood, the suffocating tang of C4 smoke, and the heavy, lingering aura of Thomas Vance's cruelty. Swimming submerged in the pitch-black lake, guided only by the digital compass on her wrist, Natalie was no longer a soldier at war. She was just a mother going home. By the time she reached the secluded cove where she had stashed her diving gear and a change of clothes, the wail of police sirens across the water had multiplied into a deafening chorus. Red and blue lights fractured the darkness over Mercer Island, reflecting off the water like broken glass. The FBI was swarming the Apex Vanguard compound. Thomas Vance's reign of terror was officially over. Natalie stripped off the freezing neoprene drysuit. her fingers numb and clumsy. She threw on a heavy wool sweater and tactical cargo pants, wincing sharply as the fabric brushed against her battered ribs. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But the adrenaline still humming in her veins wouldn't let her stop. Not yet. She hiked back to the hidden logging road where she had parked a secondary extraction vehicle, a beat-up, anonymous pickup truck Jax had staged for her. Turning the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life, and Natalie cranked the heater to the maximum as she pulled onto the empty highway heading east back into the Cascade Mountains. The sky ahead of her began to change. The oppressive, bruised purple of the night slowly bled into a soft, fragile gold. Dawn was breaking. The drive took an hour and a half, but to Natalie, it felt like a lifetime. She listened to the local news radio station, the signal crackling as she climbed higher into the mountains. Breaking news out of Mercer Island this morning. Federal agents, acting on a massive anonymous data leak, have raided the estate of Thomas Vance, CEO of Apex Vanguard. Sources confirm Vance is in custody and currently receiving medical treatment for severe lacerations. The leaked documents reportedly tie the private security firm to a string of assassinations across the Pacific Northwest, orchestrated on behalf of the Chicago-based real estate conglomerate, Horizon Dynamics. Natalie reached out and clicked the radio off. She didn't need to hear the rest. Eleanor Vance would finally have the truth about her husband. Arthur, Marcus, and Sarah would have their justice. And Elias Thorne would get to live out his retirement in peace. The pickup truck's tires crunched over the familiar gravel of the mountain switchback. As the dense pine trees parted, Jax's heavy timber cabin came into view, bathed in the warm, golden light of the morning sun. Sitting on the front porch steps, wrapped in a thick wool blanket with a mug of steaming coffee in his massive hands, was Jax. His designated marksman rifle was nowhere in sight. When he saw the truck pull up, a slow, genuine smile spread across his bearded face. He stood up, setting the mug on the railing. Natalie parked the truck and opened the door. Her legs felt like lead, and her right side burned with a deep, throbbing ache. But as she stepped onto the dirt driveway, the front door of the cabin flew open. "Mom!" Cole burst through the doorway, his sneakers pounding against the wooden porch. He didn't look like a terrified boy on the run. He looked like a kid who had just had the greatest sleepover of his life. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt of Jax's and holding his stuffed Captain Bear like a shield. Natalie dropped to her knees in the dirt, completely ignoring the agonizing flare of pain in her ribs. She threw her arms open. Cole collided with her, wrapping his small arms tightly around her neck. He smelled like wood smoke, hot cocoa, and absolute innocence. Natalie buried her face in his shoulder, holding him so tight she thought her heart might burst. For the first time since Arthur Vance's crime scene photos slid across her desk, the cold, hardened armor of Major Cross fractured, and Natalie let out a shaky, tearful breath. "I missed you, buddy," she whispered into his hair, her voice cracking. "I missed you too," Cole mumbled, pulling back to look at her face. His green eyes, so much like hers, widened as he saw the small bandage on her cheek and the deep circles of exhaustion under her eyes. "Did you finish the secret mission, Mom?" Natalie reached up, gently wiping a smudge of dirt from his cheek. She looked past him to Jax, who was leaning against the porch post, giving her a silent nod of profound respect. She looked back at her son and smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I did, Cole. The bad guys are gone. The mission is officially a success." "Does that mean we don't have to be invisible anymore?" "No more hiding," Natalie promised, kissing his forehead. "We're safe." Later that morning, while Cole was inside watching cartoons on an ancient TV set, Natalie sat on the porch with Jax. He handed her a fresh cup of black coffee and a small, white pill. Prescription-strength anti-inflammatory. Jax grunted, sitting down in the wooden rocking chair next to her. "Take it before I have to set those ribs myself." Natalie swallowed the pill with a sip of hot coffee, staring out at the breathtaking expanse of the mountain valley. The fog had completely burned off, leaving behind a crisp, crystal-clear morning. "You did good, Nat," Jax said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You saved a lot of people." "I just wanted to save him," Natalie replied, looking through the cabin window at her son. "Sometimes, protecting your own means standing between the wolves and the rest of the flock." Jax mused, "You can't outrun who you are. Major, you're a healer. Sometimes you use a scalpel. And sometimes, you use C4. Natalie chuckled, a soft sound that caused a dull ache in her chest. But she didn't mind. Jax was right. For years, she had tried to completely bury the soldier she used to be, thinking that the only way to be a good mother was to be completely ordinary. But Thomas Vance had taught her a valuable lesson. The world wasn't always safe. And being a good mother didn't mean hiding from the dark. It meant knowing exactly how to fight the monsters that lived in it. She took another sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her battered body. Cross investigations wouldn't be taking on any more petty theft or cheating spouse cases. If the police wouldn't look closer at the shadows in Seattle, she would. "You can stay here as long as you need," Jax offered. "The air is good for the soul." "A few days," Natalie agreed, leaning back in the chair and closing her eyes against the bright morning sun. "Just until the ribs heal. Then, we go home." The scent of sterile gauze, burnt sand, and copper was finally gone. In its place was the smell of pine trees, fresh coffee, and the undeniable, beautiful scent of a new beginning. The doctor was resting, the soldier was at peace, and the mother was right where she belonged.